Okay, another critical, collection of subcortical nuclei is a structure that's known as the thalamus. And the thalamus is located right in the middle of the brain. So I'm going to take this apart. So here's our, cerebrum again. I've removed the cerebellum because it falls all the time. I'm going to separate the brain into two halves here. You can see, once again, the brain stem. Right here's the different components of the brain stem. Down here would be the spinal cord. This is what we call a mid-sagittal slice of the brain right here. So the brainstem actually consists of three regions. There's the medulla, or some people say medulla. There's this kind of bulgy portion here. This is called the pons. And then this area here is called the midbrain. And then right above this is a structure called the thalamus. So this right here in the middle, and let me take this part off here so you can really sort of see it a little bit better. This is the brainstem again. And, this structure right here, and there's a left and a right thalamus, it consists of multiple gray matter nuclei. And each one of them is kind of like a relatively discrete sort of channel for distributing, a lot of afferent information, like a lot of incoming sensory information, from nuclei in the thalamus, where there's going to be this gray matter. Remember, there's going to be synaptic connectivity. I got to find another neuron here. Anyway, well, when one neuron connects to another, it's going to, receive incoming sensory information, let's say from your eyes. There's a specific thalamic nucleus that receives that information and then distributes it on to, for example, for visual information, the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. So the occipital lobe then actually sends a great deal of, cabling of white matter back to that same nucleus in the thalamus. So there's a lot of thalamo, from the thalamus, cortical, connectivity, white matter connectivity, which is important to some extent because we're going to see that the thalamus is sort of like the initial processor of lots of independent channels of sensory information, like auditory information. There's an obligatory synapse in a nucleus in the thalamus before it gets distributed to the temporal lobe for somatosensory information about, touch or pressure or body position. Remember that stuff that's got to go to the parietal lobe for spatial mapping. There's a specific thalamic nucleus that's going to receive that, kind of somatosensory information and then distribute it to the parietal lobe where, the parietal lobe will send lots of projections back to. So there's a lot of talking between these regions. Remember the visceral gut and the injury information and the temperature and the itch information. There's also going to be a thalamic nucleus right there in the middle, basically, that's going to then process that incoming information from the enteric nervous system initially and then distribute that, to maps in the insular lobe. So every, sort of sensory or afferent input, whether we're describing visceral input, touch input, visual input, auditory input, every, type of afferent input, even like information about, how much glucose is in the blood and things like that. It's all going to be, going through some sort of obligatory nucleus in this structure called the thalamus, which sits right on top of the brainstem before distribution to specific areas, specific lobes, specific regions of cortex. The only exception to that, actually, is a very ancient chemical sense. So it turns out that olfaction, smell, right, has more direct input into areas of the brain, of the cortex, without any obligatory stop, initial processing stop in, a nucleus in the thalamus. But the thalamus, for other sensory inputs, all of the sensory inputs aside from smell or olfaction, there's going to be some kind of an obligatory nucleus synaptic connection before distribution, onto cortex. So it's a very interesting organization of the brain. You got a gatekeeper to some extent for sensory input, and then lots of crosstalk through the with these specific nuclei that are dealing with vision, audition, somatosensation, etc. And the cortex in the brain.